Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I am Elizabeth, the events coordinator for Gibson's Bookstore, and I am very pleased to be joined by some poets this evening as we celebrate the publication of Portsmouth poet Samantha DeFlitch and her new book of poetry, Confluence. She is joined in conversation by her friend and fellow poet, Shelley Girdner. Confluence is available from Gibson's Bookstore. We have curbside shopping, in-store browsing, and we are very happy to ship a book to you. Thank you to the two of you for joining me this evening.
Thank you so much for having us, Elizabeth. I am very happy to be here.
To our audience members, we will be answering questions later in the event. So if you'd like to drop those into the chat or Q&A feature, we would be happy to answer those a little later in the event. If you'd like to talk to your fellow audience members, make sure that your chat is set to all panelists and attendees. And with that note, please take it away.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here. It's lovely that we can sort of gather in this space this evening. I'm especially grateful to Shelley for joining me. Shelley has seen this book from poems to thesis to drafts to actually a book. And I feel like Shelley knows the book better than I know the book. So it was only natural that I asked if she could join me. I feel like she's been a constant voice of sort of insight and revelation about all these wonderful moments in the book. So Shelley, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me and congratulations. I love your book. I'm so excited to talk to you about it. I was actually just remembering today that it was several years ago when you were in grad school and I was a judge for a poetry contest. And I realized I could remember physically where I was standing when I was reading some of the poems that are in the book, right? I think it's Down Birds and the Crossing Hot Metal Bridge in particular are the ones I remember.
Definitely.
The most vividly. And I just remember, and I just love that about poetry, that you can remember encountering the poem, but the way the world of the poem is so present. But then physically, I knew where I was in Hamsmith. I was standing in that little foyer area on the second floor. So just that sheer transportive power. And I was realizing how long I've lived with some of these poems and gotten to have them with me and love them. So I'm so excited to be able to talk about them and to talk with you. So I was going to ask you first if, and we talked a little bit about this, you don't really call yourself a poet. Is that true?
I do not.
And you don't call yourself a writer? Like if you said, I thought it was hilarious. You said, I just wait for my mom to introduce me as a poet.
I do.
What do you?
Yeah. So yeah, I hold on. You're joining. No. So okay, everybody, you get the dog back. Yeah, I don't. It was an interesting question that you brought up, but I don't ever really introduce myself as a poet or even as a writer. If I'm meeting somebody new and we're kind of chatting, I'll say that, I work at UNH, I work at a writing center, but I'll rarely, if ever, bring up that I write anything, let alone poetry. I think it's still me sort of still getting over the weightiness of saying I'm a poet. I think that there's a lot that goes with that, and there's a lot that's behind that. So I suppose I'm still working around that. Any advice?
No, it's such a funny word. So I think I tend to say writer, like I'm a writer. Well, because when you say like I'll say I write poems, and then people will very often say, I hate poetry, right? Like it's so interesting. Nobody says like, oh, I hate fiction, but there's a real
I hate
comfort. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it is. Yeah, it is really interesting. There's a certain energy that goes with, I write poems, I write poetry. Everybody has a specific association with that. And a lot of times it's either negative, like from a high school poetry class that wasn't fantastic, or there's sort of like a flinching back, like taking the hand off the stove, like immediately changing the conversation, because it at times feels like this is a hard thing to touch. This is a hard thing to dig into. So yes, but I do like I'm a writer, I write poems. That feels like a softer transition. Yeah.
Yes. I do offer a writer is easier for whatever reasons. Yep. And then one of the other things I wanted to start with was just scent. So we talked a little bit about this, that scent actually shows up a lot in your poems, and not I mean, your poems are so sensory and we get so much descriptive detail. So it makes sense that sight is there and sound is there, but there's also just great sense. There's the asphalt and the oranges and even the rotten oranges, right? There's rotten oranges. There's fried onions in one poem right next to fried pierogies in the next poem, which I love. And it reminded me of Mike Birbiglia's podcast, Working It Out. To get people started, he says, what's a scent from your childhood? So what's a scent from your childhood?
Yeah, so I think I had noted that you bringing up there's so much sensory detail in these poems, and I thought, oh my God, I've never actually noticed these smells through the poems until you pointed them out, and I was going back and I was reading it, and it was so fascinating to me. So that's been really interesting to sort of meditate on. For me, those smells from my childhood, things like cut grass, campfire smoke, and I really love like pavement after it's rained in the summer, and it's so sort of warm. But as I noted that I never say these scents, I never say the pavement after a summer rainstorm in the poems, even though I love that smell so much. I'll say like asphalt or damp asphalt, which I was thinking is sort of, it's like a reflexive shorthand. It's like shorthand for me. Like when you, Sam, read asphalt, think damp pavement after a summer rainstorm, which does limit the audience a bit, I suppose. It turns it into a very like interior poem that I'm sort of writing for myself. But it was very interesting to see where that did pop up throughout the book.
Yeah. I mean, I think we'll get sort of to that idea of the shorthand for the self in a little bit when we start talking about Richard Hugo. But do you remember the first story or piece of writing that you wrote that you were proud of?
Oh my goodness. I think I'd have to go back a ways for in my childhood. I was always a little writer. I was writing a lot growing up. I can remember, and I don't think I remember anything in particular, but I remember making like these little books out of like a couple of pages of paper that are sort of bent and like stapled together, and the first chapbook. So yeah, but I can remember doing that from a very young age. But I still can remember the first poem that I actually brought to workshop at UNH. And it is not in the book, but there are lines of it in the book, which is really interesting how it's sort of been broken apart and put into new places. So, yeah.
Nothing's ever lost.
Nothing's ever lost, only put in a new place.
Yeah.
So.
So what do you think are the through lines since we're talking about sort of nothing is ever lost and the way things fit together, what are the through lines you were thinking about when you were shaping the book and the through lines that surprised you?
Yeah, I think a lot of the through lines ended up really surprising me. And I think a lot of them only really appeared when I found the right order for the book, when I found the way that the poems were supposed to be next to each other on the page and the section they were supposed to be in and the way that this story was supposed to be told, right? I think was really struggling with that in some of the early orderings, that it just felt like poem, 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 instead of almost one long poem, really, the way that these pieces sort of broken apart and put back together. So I think that there's less subject matter through line, at least from my perception, and more sort of image and motif through line, which themselves become subjects in a larger sense when they're put in these new places against each other. So, I can say things like dogs, oranges, grandmothers, bridges, structures, body parts like hands and throats and things like that, which again, that's not a subject matter in and of itself, but I think when the book is viewed as almost one long continuation of exploration of those images and motifs, they do become a through line in a subject matter. So,
Yeah. How did you were just talking a little bit about order. So how did you finally figure out the order?
A lot of time on like a zoomed out Word document, just kind of going like this. I think the first thing that struck me is it had to be divided into 3 sections. It just sort of felt like the natural impulse. It's what everybody does. So I was like, all right, I'm going to give it a go. And I think that provided a lot of, within the structure of 3 sections, a lot of freedom to play around with what goes in each of these sections, right? And I realized that I couldn't order these by subject matter. Like I couldn't put like family poems, poems about bridges, poems about dogs. It wasn't going to work that way. And I think that it was a lot of going through and seeing where the repetition of lines happened and how placing those in a certain order developed sort of the entire atmosphere of the book. I think that I find the early section to be poems that sort of set a stage, for lack of a better term. It's by no means like setting making, right? But I do think that there are poems that say this is where something happened or something will begin. And I think that the middle part of the poem, there's a lot of people poems, and it's almost like populating the space that was created in the first section. And then the third section feels very transitory, almost like rising above that scene and saying like, here's what has like broken forth out of all of this. So I think at least tonight, that's where I've landed with the ordering.
Yeah, so more, it's sort of almost like the poem's, the motion that's inside the poem is what helped you figure out the order.
Definitely. Yeah, because I don't think there's a ton of space. I don't think there's a ton of rest permitted. I think there's like a constant forward momentum in these poems. And I think I had to be careful in areas that felt like they backtracked a little bit, that we didn't backtrack really, really far. You know, it was sort of a stepping back and then 2 steps forward sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, I want to get to hearing you read. So I have one question just designed to get us there. If I can ask about the grandmother spirit in your poems, right? That 2 of my favorite poems mention a grandmother. And there's one in particular where a grandmother tells a granddaughter to write, which I really love. So I was wondering about that grandmother spirit in your life, and if you could tell us about her or them.
Sure, absolutely. So I think you know, every speaker needs someone to speak to. And I, you know, for the longest time I was struggling to identify a specific audience for the book, you know, other than myself trying to understand myself. And I think what came out of it is sort of like the grandmother figure as being the audience for this book, you know, sort of me saying, look what I did, you know, to that grandmother figure. So I think that there is sort of like a combining of grandmother figures in the book. But, you know, as I kind of noted to you, I really do believe sort of in this, you know, and I've since written poems about this almost prophetic power of some of the women who have come before me, before us. One of my grandmothers, you know, I can remember her saying that, you know, your writing will take you places. And it was a very, very vague statement, you know, at the time, but, you know, clearly something is happening here. So I really like the idea of this book of poems being sort of addressed to that grandmother figure. So yeah. So with that, maybe I'll jump into a few of those poems. So I would like to show everybody the book. If you don't, thank you. Now I'm big. So this is Confluence, and before I jump in, I just want to make a quick note on the cover art. I had the great fortune of my editor fully supporting my collaboration with my mom, Connie, who is actually an artist working in the North Country, and she created this piece especially for the book. So that was a very special collaboration. So thanks, Mom. So I suppose I'll start with one of the grandmother poems. If you're following along at home, this is page 9, Crossing the Hot Metal Street Bridge. It was late January and I was crossing Forbes at 5th. There was an old woman sitting in a folding chair there. She was shouting that the miracle would take place in a studio apartment in Saugerties. It was too cold for anyone to be making prophecy that day, or any day in January, really. But there she was, a small wonder. I could hear her on the hot metal street bridge, with all its spires, messy, knotted, soaring upward into the gray-lit skyline, and all at once, I forgot where I was. The old woman was my grandmother, or me, if I lingered on the bridge too long. Everything was a very wide dream. The lights from the windows of the skyscrapers expanding outward, pushing each other into stars. This was real. As the city grew wide, I crouched beneath the towering post to touch the rusted steel. Big Ben was dying. On the south side, Mike taped Friday's Trib over cracked panes of glass at his bar, but still the old woman's voice seeping under the windowsill. My mother was frying pierogies. She stepped away from the cast iron skillet to gaze out the window where snowpack cleaved to tracks and my father carried an old lab in his arms, the wind sharp on her nose that raised, twitching into evening air. So I suppose I'd like to move on to the poem that Shelley was noting about the grandmother instructing the granddaughter to write, because I think that lends itself nicely to moving into a conversation about how some of the poems do speak to each other in really interesting ways. So this is on page 25, and it's called Instructions My Grandmother Left. In some unexpected country, I remember a great oak in the desert. Dream me this, granddaughter, your palms at the base of the tree growing at the first conscious thought of skyline. When they stare at your hands, what will they see? For me, my hands wrinkle. I grew old. Tell me, what will you plant there or bury? Don't let it be me. Give my body to the Ohio. Do you remember an evergreen bound up in light? Did we do that with our hands? Free the roots of the oak. For me, do this. For me. Why have they dressed me in this paper gown? Why do you visit so late? Find yourself canned pears in my cupboard. Feed yourself. I lived. Maybe when I have climbed deep and far away, you will drag fingers across unbroken sand. Write my name. So I think that potentially either opens us up to move into a poem that really echoes that, where somebody else is writing in the sand, or a conversation about hands, and I don't know where to go. So Shelley, do you have any?
I think keep reading a little bit.
I will keep reading then, absolutely. So I think there is a poem on page, I should know because I wrote it. So page 37. So I think there are real echoes throughout the book of what Shelley and I were speaking about, of lines and words and sometimes entire poems that have come before. And that's enough intro, I suppose. Strays. It is all very much the same. You love a girl. You are washing clothes in a 24-hour laundromat that doubles as a sandwich joint. It is late or early. It is the wrong hour. It is 2 a.m. and there is a stray cattle dog pacing, stalking bent moonlight between dryers. There is howling in the parking lot. You lose yourself in a handful of quarters, in the fluorescent sheen of linoleum. So it goes. Tell me, where do we go from here? The girl moves west like they all do eventually. She bends beneath the acacia plant. In the sand, she writes something wild to watch it blow away in the wind. So very interested in how the moment of writing in the sand, I suppose, returns.
You say that like you're totally surprised by its return.
I am surprised by its return. I think, I think you noted a few places where things disappeared and came back, like the laundromat comes back, and the girl beneath the sand comes back on the next page. And it's, I suppose I like that I can continue to be surprised by the things I find in the book.
The connections. Yeah, it reminds me of the review you sent. I can't remember her name, but the woman who said the poems read because there is so much repetition. Sometimes whole lines are repeating, like the sort of opening poem gets to come back in pieces throughout the collection. And she mentioned sometimes it reads like guzzles or huzzles, that poetic form where we repeat a word at the end of every line, that she could find basically your words is what I was taking her review to be, that she could find the words that were there and she was reading the poems as these deconstructed ones, which I thought was really beautiful, and beautiful to think about. And it sort of brings us to that question of repetition and how conscious you were. I'm assuming not that conscious in the writing, but how conscious were you of the repetition as you were shaping the manuscript and putting it together?
Definitely. Yeah, I loved that review of the idea of a deconstructed guzzle because I love that form. I've never written like strictly in it. So to sort of see it broken apart and put together back that way in the book, I thought was a really beautiful observation. Yeah, so in terms of, I suppose, repetition and how conscious I was of that, I can say that it emphatically was not a stylistic choice for me, to say, hey, I'm gonna take this poem and put it down here. And it wasn't even sort of like I'm trying something new sort of thing to see how it works. I think for me, there's a lot tied up in trying to better understand something. So whether that's a concept, a moment, a memory, or even just like a word or a line, there's a lot that can be done in terms of understanding with repetition and repeated repetition. I think there's a simultaneous sort of like grounding that allows for like a freedom to explore something when that much space for repetition is allowed to say a thing again and again and again and again. I think I sent you an interview that I'm currently in the process of doing where I sort of described repetition as a very physical spiritual practice, that the act of saying the same word or line over and over again isn't necessarily a way to get it right or a way to get it perfect. It's just a way to do it, I guess. And I don't think that there's necessarily a lot of space ever for us to just do something again and again and again. So I think there's a freeingness of that as well. And I think it a lot of times opens me up to talk about something in the poems that I don't necessarily want to talk about or want to directly address. So I think there are moments of trauma in these poems that the speaker does return to in this use of repetition that are sort of angling in at things in a different way. Something I noticed really in particular was the repetition of body parts. So head and things in the throat and hands and palms and thighs and, all of these really interesting attempts to construct a body without ever really presenting a complete and full body in the poems. And for me, as somebody who I suffer from chronic pain, and we've talked about that a lot. And I think it's the poem's attempts to say, I'd like to talk about this, but I'm not going to. And it's sort of constantly like bubbling beneath the surface that the body would like to be there, but it's not fully there. But again, that use of repetition serves to say, this is still here, this is still here. And I love it. And I'm not stopping repetition. So second book, it's still going to be just the same poem 15 times. So yeah.
But how risky did it feel? Because to me, it seems like that's one of the things, like particularly in like a workshop format, you're leaving yourself vulnerable with some repetition, right? Like if it's insistent repetition, you can say, no, it's intentional. But does it feel vulnerable? Did it feel like a risk when you were doing it? How did you settle with yourself that this is what you had to do?
I think in the process of putting the book together in what was going to be its final format, I realized that the repetition was the book. There was no book without everything coming back and looping in on itself. The poems are always returning, the body is always returning, the year is always returning to us. And I think that if I had shied away from that repetition, then book would not be called Confluence. I think it would be something different entirely. And I think you're right, in a workshop, repetition is risky and it opens you up to some criticism. I think I was far enough removed from that to realize like it was okay to put the book together in this way and in this order. So, and I don't think it, yeah, like I said, even though it's not necessarily a conscious choice, it's something that I continue to see. And I think that's okay. I think I think we all have our obsessions, in art or in poetry or in life, and bringing them back to better understand them in a new light is, I think it's a really freeing and really beautiful process. So,
trying to read some more now.
I would love to read some more now. Absolutely. So I'm gonna read a poem called Garbage Night, because it is Thursday night, and the poem starts with "It is Thursday night," so it just had to be. But it is a poem that does make use of some repetition, right, and changing words and things like that. So, it is Thursday night. It is garbage night. The trash is my old clothes, and my old clothes are slipping through my hands. My hands are a box full of flies. The flies are taking off with my hair. Look, I am bald. I am my mother's truck engine. I am the space the deer left sleeping in the ferns. I am 7:52 in the evening. See, the sun has already set and the dog is crying to go out. Am I her too? Her nose raised, twitching into the evening air. My parents are getting old. I don't like to say that out loud, but it's true. The dog is old too. I am rubbing the dog's legs. I am a car full of empty coffee cups. See, I can't bring myself to dump them. They remind me of yesterday. I am all the days that the sky has broken clear and cold, spilling oranges across the dawn line. I am the Ohio line. I am West Side Road after all the tourists have left for the day. I am laying myself down on the asphalt to watch the stars come out in real soaring spires above my head until the dog begins her howling. I am waking all the days. I am the ferns and I keep space for you, for the coffee cups. I am peeling my long body off asphalt and gone round back to feed the chickens. And I think I'd like to read the longer poem in the book, but I think reading it right now is a really good maybe illustration of how, these poems are broken apart. That's so violent. These poems are are gently coaxed apart and placed into new spots. So this is page 46. Come out, all you moths. Thursday night is garbage night. My trash is old clothes. My old clothes are spilling through my hands. My hands are a box full of flies. The flies are taking off with my hair. Look, I am bald. I am my mother's truck engine. I am the space the deer left sleeping in the ferns. I am 7:52 in the evening. Babushka, come find me. Babushka, the dog is old and John is not. And also I left pumpkins rotting outside and only their caved in shells are left and the gap in my screen door. At night I soak my sheets. At night John puts a bullet in his head. I am the dog's shaking legs. Come out, all you moths. I am all the days that the sky has broken clear, cold in the west. I am spilling oranges across the dawn line, spilling, wild blackbirds pouring themselves over a horizon. I am the Ohio line. I am West Side Road after all tourists have left for the day. I am laying my body down on the asphalt. See, I am pumpkins and the dog has taken up her howling. Babushka, what does it mean to grow old? It is late November. The shade is grazing the tops of the pines and soon it will be purple, dark. I am peeling myself out of bed. I am driving the car. I am driving the car. I am the car. I am late to pick up the children. Somewhere John is putting the bullet in his head. This sort of thing happens. To grow old really means nothing because I am growing old and the dog is growing old and my parents are growing old and John is not. Why? Because he didn't want to. And maybe that's the trick. After all, who really wants to carry the dog out into the yard on a January night because she can't walk anymore? Because that's the sort of thing you have to do when you get old. And someday you'll be the dog too. Anyway, I speed up. I am late to pick up the children, and I promised I would not be late. I think that use of anyway was something I had noted as a really interesting sort of word choice. It feels like when things get to be a little bit too much, it's sort of a tactic that I use to pull back, to move the poem into a new location that's away from what it's been digging into. And at times I wonder if maybe I should restrain my use of the anyway and let the poem grow a little bit more. I don't know. It's an interesting thing. Anyway does not just pop up there. It definitely pops up a few other places. So
yeah, we were collecting some of the things that repeat, some of the words and terms that repeat, and you mentioned anyway and twitching, and the one I noticed was sphagnum moss. Will you tell the story of sphagnum moss?
I absolutely will. So something that Shelley had specifically pulled out as a term that is, it's not necessarily very poetic, right? You know, it's not a musical or nice sound sphagnum moss, you know. It's not something just sonically you would put into a poem, but she had noted it seemed to have some sort of like resonance behind it, and I was like, she's right, good catch. So when I lived and worked in the White Mountains, I lived in a hut in a certain zone called the boreal forest, and one of the real hallmarks of the boreal forest is sphagnum moss that grows there, and when it rains, it just sort of like soaks up all of, that was a great sound, and it sort of soaks up all of the moisture and turns into this really beautiful like emerald coating across the forest, and it's so soft just to touch and so wonderful. So I think I didn't even think twice about putting sphagnum moss in a poem, because to me there was, in those moments, nothing more beautiful. So I think that was something that we were talking about in terms of words and phrases that were very like intensely personal. And to go back to that idea of like shorthand for myself, that's what I'm thrown to. And you pulling it out was me for the first time realizing just how ugly of a term it is. You know? But you know, it was very interesting to hear about that.
I mean, it's an ugly word, but it's not ugly in the poems. There is this like energy to it, and that's sort of why I noticed them. And we were talking about them in terms of Richard Hugo, the public poet, being like Auden, and I think a modern day public poet is probably someone like Ada Limon, who can speak to sort of real world happenings in this language that's so fresh and we follow along and we get. And I love Richard Hugo is like, listen, we all cannot be as smart as Auden. All right. We have to like, most of us are going to need to pay attention to our own selves and our own worlds and our own universe. And the way we do that is by paying attention to not the content, right, but the syntax, which is why I was thinking of Richard Hugo so much when I was reading your book. And it makes sense when you're talking about how you were pulling it together, that it wasn't driven so much by content, but by thinking about how the pieces fit together. And I love that idea. It surfaced in one of the grandmother poems where the grandmother says, feed yourself, right? And thinking about the poems as ways you're feeding yourself, ways the narrator is finding sustenance and comfort in the world. And some of those words are just really cherished and loved in the poems and are feeding the narrator and feeding the poet. And I think they're so beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah. Can we talk about the pig?
Let's talk about the pig. Thank you everybody for sticking around. Now you get to hear about the pig poem. So yeah, so the pig poem is the very last poem of the book. And honestly, I hardly even remember writing it. It feels like one of those poems that just Well, you brought up Ada Limon. So I'll bring up the Ada Limon horse poem, where she says that, and I'll butcher it now, but that a baby horse, you look and it's just born. There's just another horse there. And suddenly there are two horses where there was once one horse. And that's kind of how I feel with this poem. All of a sudden there was a poem there where there was once a blank page. So I think that there was probably something really special about it. But I love this poem very much. I think it is a really nice place to end the book. I was sort of doing a deep dive into why I loved it so much. And I think, well, there's a real gentleness to it and there's a lot of hope in it, I think. But I think there's a real wrapping up of what the book wants to say about what is special and about what is sacred and about what is, you know, holy. And it's in like the physicality of what is here and what is touchable. So I think that is why I love it so very much. So I'll just go ahead and read it. So this is like everybody's favorite poem. So that's okay. I love it very much. And this is page 54, again, if you're reading along at home. To lead a pig skyward. I read a pig can't look up, that you've got to gently tilt their heads back if they're going to take in the night skies. I never led a pig skyward late at night in Pennsylvania. Earthbound is probably better. We all start getting ideas when we look up, and the pigs, they always seemed so pleased where they were, rooting in soft earth. No need to look up for God when the holy was there, beneath their trotters, cool below the autumn archer that was rising lightly on the eastern horizon. So that's the pig poem, everybody.
That can be your next project, is a sow anthology where you just collect all the pig poems.
I have written a few more pig poems since. I don't know if I'll ever be able to, you know, just hit the nail on that.
But like, go find, because there are lots of. I mean, it's kind of like the anti-poetry animal, but because it's an anti-poetry animal, I feel like it actually ends up showing up in a lot of poems. So it'd be fun to put yours in that stream, the tradition of pig poems.
I would love it. I read recently that the most poetic fruit is a mango, that it's in everybody's poems. And right off the bat, I thought, there are no mangoes in my book. And
there's a mango. I know.
I said, I just do oranges, but no, couldn't get away from the trap. So yeah, I feel like pigs, gas stations, pavement, they don't get their poems. So
yeah. You have a lot of seatbelts too.
I have a shocking amount of seatbelts. So
yeah, you're very safe.
I know. Precious cargo. I grew up in Pennsylvania where seatbelts are mandatory. So I feel like, you know, it's not like so. But
do you want to end on the pig poem, or do you want to read another poem or two?
You know, I think for now we could end on the pig poem and see what's in the chat. And if there's not much, I can always go back and read a few more. So yeah.
Right. So we do have one question in the chat that's from Rosalind, right? Who says she wants to know about the decision to use sections to break up the book by rivers. So yeah, when did that aha moment come that they were rivers?
Yeah, so I think you know, they were 1, 2, 3, right? You know, and then I think right after 1, 2, 3, they were Monongahela, Allegheny, Ohio. I think that Monongahela is in one of the poems. So as soon as I saw that, as I was going through reading it, I thought, oh yeah, this is it, right? But I have to say that the title came well after that. And it's odd because, you know, in Pittsburgh, literally the place where the three rivers meet, it's called either the Point, or everybody knows it as the Confluence. So you think that would have immediately hit me, but that was not the case for like months and months and months after I had the section titles. So the title of the book came much later than the section titles themselves. But I think that even just having the visual representation of physically how like the Monongahela and the Allegheny merged like this to form the Ohio like this, was actually really nice in terms of being able to sort of go back and nitpick with the ordering and what poems were where in terms of how this convergence was really working throughout the book. Thanks, Rosalind.
So then so Larry says, Larry has a question in the chat. I love your folding chairs, which are such an efficient image of temporary place. Is that how you think of them?
So Larry's actually my editor with Broadstone. So hello, Larry. I'm so glad you could join. I'm not sure if consciously that's how I was thinking of them, but you're right. They are constant throughout the book, especially in I'm thinking of the poem where the grandmother is sitting in the folding chair in Pittsburgh, and there is like this constant forward movement in that poem. There's really no space to rest. So I think it's a really, not to toot my own horn, but quite an effective use of an image or, to represent this idea that there is constant movement and a transitory nature throughout the book. I think of the folding chairs, I think of the gas stations, I think of the cars that are constantly in motion and the seatbelt that goes along with the car. The idea of a turnpike and a toll station. I think these are places where, very much like a folding chair, we open them and we make use of them, and then we fold them back up and we keep on moving. So I think that there's a lot sort of linked to each other in those sort of images of no place to rest, for a long period of time, keep on moving. So yeah, I think it's a great question.
You see the other question in the chat?
If you had to fight one of the following, which would you choose and why? The shark from Jaws out of water or the T-Rex from Jurassic Park but underwater? Listen, I saw that one Jurassic Park movie. I'm gonna assume this is John, where those dinosaurs, they can't do anything in water. Could you imagine the T-Rex trying to go like this with its little arms? I'll take the water. I think that's the right answer. So your middle schoolers came up with it. John, tell your middle schoolers I said hello. They are very wonderful.
I'll ask a question here. When you are writing poems, you mentioned writing poems for an audience. How often are your poems written for yourself versus for an audience?
That's a great question. I think a lot of the time they are written for myself. I think a lot of my poems, especially as I've been writing the past year or two, very intensely personal, but not so personal that they can't, obviously be accessible. I think there are ways for me to sort of understand different things about myself and, different things that are surrounding me and happening to me. So I think, myself as the audience of one, right? But I think that I don't, again, want it to be so personal, as Shelley and I were discussing earlier, that it's not accessible. It's not something that somebody else could read and get something out of, even if it's just a line or a word, really. So yeah. Hi, Becca. I'm seeing a question from Becca. What's one of your favorite books from when you were a little cricket that you still think about today? That's a great question, Becca. I think that Shelley had asked me a similar question, and I said I was totally blanking on an answer to that. I can, what's sticking out in my head is this huge book that we had, and in my mind it was like this big, right? And it was the Book of Virtues, and it had these like beautiful illustrations in it. I think you know what I'm talking about. In my mind, this book is massive, right? And I can remember there are these the little kind of critters that were, the illustrated animals in it, which I feel like Becca is it's very your energy as well, right? The small animals doing great things. So that's one of the things that I can remember very clearly. Definitely. Is there another one? I feel like.
Yeah, Lily's got one in there where she says, Creeley said a book of poems is really just a bunch of poems written in a period of time. Would you say this was true for you, or did you have more of a vision in the process?
Hi, Lily, and congrats on your thesis defense today. Sending you a lot of love. So I would love to say that I had a long-term vision in the process. But thank you for giving me that wonderful out. But I think that a lot of these poems were poems that I've written, over the past 4 or 5 years, a lot of them while I was in the grad program at UNH. And they sort of really culminated in my thesis. And I think once I had the thesis together, there was more vision and there was a lot more intention moving forward that, okay, this could be a book. It's not right now, but it could be. So I think that's sort of where I started with that. But I would never be able to say, like, when I started writing this book, it was my intent to have an exploration of like human experience through the use of like how images repeat themselves in our lives. And I wish I had been able to sort of enter with that intention, but I was not. But yeah, I think Creeley was right, at least, in this, this is just a bunch of poems that were written over a period of time that I think really, thankfully, I was able to have the space to make them into something that felt like one big poem that's just over 50 some pages. So thank you. Thanks, Lily. That was a great question. Are there any others?
Yep, there's a couple others. Kimberly asked, I follow the themes of staying and leaving in your book. You bring great compassion to both movements, if staying can be thought of as a movement, which I think it can. Can you speak a bit to how the making of these poems, this book, perhaps clarified your own thinking about staying or leaving as kinds of necessary movement?
Oh my goodness, Kimberly, what a wonderful, wonderful question. I love the idea of staying as movement, right? Staying is making some sort of very conscious choice about where we're choosing to place ourselves. I'm wondering if the book did provide any clarity for me, to be totally honest, which I think is a very odd thing to say, but as I'm still being surprised by the book, then I don't think that that's totally out of pocket. I think the book did certainly clarify for me the idea of place with a capital P in terms of where I came from. And I think was almost a book for me, which, almost gave me permission to say it's okay to engage in both movement and in settling down in place. And again, that these two things aren't mutually exclusive. I'm thinking of the poem that I read where the grandmother instructs the granddaughter to free the roots of the oak tree in the desert. So there's already like a weird displacement there, right? An oak tree in the desert. And then the idea of freeing the roots from the sand and potentially displacing it or something like that. So yeah, I'm not sure I have a very straightforward answer on that, but I do really love your observation that there's a compassion and a real gentleness for both of these things, for the transitory nature that both staying and leaving sort of bring with it. So thank you.
We have two more. One, Nathan asks, will any poems featuring moose show up in future books?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's safe to assume, Nate, that any future poem that has the word dog in it, this face is what you can picture right here. So.
That's the shorthand?
Yes, that's the shorthand, exactly. Dog refers to corgi named Moose. So.
And then Larry asked about the description of Pittsburgh as a city of accidental lesbians. Where did this line come from? If you want to answer.
Absolutely. So I think, so the poem that is sort of in reference to is a poem that sort of takes place at Kennywood Park. And I talk about how, I'm on this roller coaster, and boy, I think the boy that I'm riding the roller coaster next to would have kissed me if everybody in high school didn't think I was a lesbian. So I was sort of really interested in that idea of what identities people sort of like slap on you, and you know, what sticks, what falls off, you know, what's true, what's not, what's partially true. So I think that the idea of being an accidental anything as sort of a tongue-in-cheek, that nothing is really an accident, nothing is really, you know, a slip up or a mistake in that sort of way. So I think that that's the idea that that's sort of leaning into. But I sort of love the idea of Pittsburgh, you know, as there's a real ethos right around this city, and then sort of taking it and flipping it on its head and saying it's a city full of like accidental lesbians. It's not, you know, like what we normally think of when we think of like a Rust Belt sort of like town in the Midwest. So I think that there was a little bit of fun I was having with that as well. So
Yeah, I think those like there are Pittsburghians who show up in your poem sometime, and like Ben Roethlisberger shows up, right?
mhm.
And thinking of like the reaction to those people making the accidental lesbians is a real joke I'm writing in my head. You know, like
It's there,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, are there any other questions? These have all been really lovely. Cool. Elizabeth, how we doing? How we doing on time?
We are at about, we've just got a couple more minutes. Did you want to close out with a poem?
Oh,
Or did you have one that you, or some nice thoughts that you like to leave us with?
see, now I'm gonna have to flip through. I'm gonna have to flip through these poems really fast and find a good one to end
Put
on.
you on the spot.
I know, no, it's fine. I will find a goodie.
While she's finding, can I read the note? I want to read like a note that Sam wrote to me. I asked her like, how and when did you start taking your own writing seriously? What did that look like for you? And Samantha said, sorry at all my profs, but after I graduated from the program, it was when I realized that if this writing was important to me, I was going to have to do it. Nobody was going to make me write poems or revise them anymore. It was me, myself, and I. And I just loved that.
Thank you. Yeah. Sorry at everybody. It's not that I didn't take it seriously at the time, but you know, it's an elevated level of seriousness. So yeah, I'll close this out with a shorty. So this one is that shorty is referring to Moose. It's on page 52 and it's called When the Wall Fell. I looked up when I heard the gates come crashing down behind Peter, and I watched him hurl the keys to the kingdom toward the earth. They landed at my feet, shuddering metal. And all around the gnarled wreckage of the collapsed gate, those who finally crossed the open threshold sang and shouted, and when the weathermen heard something like a storm building in the damp air. Down below, where I sat cross-legged, staring at the whole thing, a woman I once loved lay down beside me, and I, without looking, asked if she could hear the songs. Yes, she said, these are the years of thunder. That's what we'll end on. So thank you so much, Shelley. Thank you so much. This has just been a really lovely time to chat with you about the book, and I'm always learning new things about it. So thank you so much for the care that you put into our conversation.
My honor. Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much to both of you for joining us, and to Moose. Special thank you to Moose. But thank you for joining us and sharing these poems with us. Thank you to our audiences joining us from home. Signed copies of Confluence are available from Gibson's Bookstore. And again, we are very happy to ship, offer curbside pickup or in-store browsing. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great night.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.